So, Harry Potter Goblet of Fire, Chapter 9, The Dark Mark. Don't tell your mother you've been gambling, Mr. Weasley implored Fred and George as they all made their way slowly down the purple carpeted stairs. Don't worry, Dad, said Fred gleefully. We've got big plans for our money. We don't want it confiscated. Mr. Weasley looked for a moment as though he was going to ask what these big plans were, but seemed to decide upon reflection that he didn't want to know. They were soon caught up in the crowds now flooded out of the stadium and back to their campsites. Ruckus singing was borne towards them on the night air as they retraced their steps along the lantern-lit path. The leprechauns kept shooting over their heads, cackling and waving their lanterns. When they finally reached the tents, nobody felt like sleeping at all, and given the level of noise around them, Mr. Weasley agreed that they all have had one last cup of cocoa together before turning in. They were soon arguing enjoyably about the match. Mr. Weasley got drawn into the disagreement about cobbing with Charlie, and it was only when Ginny fell asleep right at the tiny table and spilled hot cocoa all over the floor that Mr. Weasley called a halt to the verbal replays and insisted that everybody went to bed. Hermione and Ginny went into the next tent, and Harry and the rest of the Weasleys changed into their pajamas and chambered into their bunks. From the other side of the campsite, they could still hear much singing and odd echoing bang. Oh, I'm glad I'm not on duty, muttered Mr. Weasley sleepily. I wouldn't fancy having to go and tell the Irish they've got to stop celebrating. Harry, who was on the top bunk above Ron, lay staring up at the canvas ceiling of the tent, watching the glow of an occasional leprechaun lantern flying overhead, and picturing again some of Crumb's more spectacular moves. He was itching to get back on their own fireball and try out the Wronski feint. Somehow Oliver Wood had never managed to convey what all the wiggling diagrams and all that move was supposed to look like. Harry saw himself in robes and had his name on the back, and imagined that the sensation of hearing hundreds and thousands of people, crowds roar as Ludo Bagman's voice echoed throughout the stadium, I give you Potter! Harry never knew whether he had actually dropped off to sleep or not. His fantasies of flying, like Crumb, might have been slipped into the actual dreams. All he knew was that quite suddenly, Mr. Weasley was shouting, Get up, Ron! Hurry! Come on now, get up! This is urgent! Harry sat up quickly and hit the top of his head. Whoops! And the top of his head hit the canvas. "'Smatter," he said. Dimly he could tell that something was wrong. The noises in the campsite had changed, and singing had stopped. He could hear screams and the sounds of people running. He slipped down from the bunk and reached for his clothes, but Mr. Weasley, who had pulled over his jeans over his pajamas, said, No time, Harry. Just grab a jacket and get outside quickly. He did as he told, hurried out of the tent, Ron at his heels. By the light of the few fires that were still burning, he could see people running away into the woods, fleeing. Something that was moving across the field towards them. Something that was emitting odd flashes of light and noises like gunfire. Loud jeering, roars and laughter, and drunken yells were drifting towards them. Then came a burst of strong green light, which illuminated the scene. A crowd of wizards, tightly packed and moving together with wands pointed straight upwards, was marching slowly across the field. Harry squinted at them. They didn't seem to have faces. Then he realized that their heads were hooded and their faces were masked. High above them, floating along the mid-air, 4 struggling figures were being controlled into grotesque shapes. It was as though the masked wizards on the ground were puppeteers, and the people above them were marionettes, operated by invisible strings that rose from the wands into the air. 2 of the figures were very small. More wizards were joining the marching group, laughing and pointing at the floating bodies. Tents crumpled, and fell as the marching crowds swelled. Once or twice, Harry saw one of the marchers blast a tent out of the way with his wand. Several caught fire. The screaming grew louder. The floating people were suddenly illuminated as they passed over a burning tent, and Harry recognized one of them, Mr. Roberts, the campsite manager. The other three looked as though they might have been his wife and children. One of the marchers below flipped Mr. Roberts upside down with his wand. Her nightdress, Mrs. Roberts upside down with his wand. Her nightdress fell down to reveal voluminous drawers. She struggled to cover herself as the crowds below her screeched and hooted with glee. That's sick, Ron muttered, watching the smallest muggle child who had begun to spin like a top 60 feet above the ground. His head flopping limply from one side, lipping from side to side. That is really sick. Hermione and Ginny were hurrying towards them, pulling coats over their nightdresses, with Mr. Weasley right behind them. At the same moment, Bill, Charlie, and Percy emerged from the boys' tent, fully dressed, with their sleeves rolled up and their wands out. We're going to help the ministry, Mr. Weasley shouted over the noise, rolling up his own sleeves. You lot, get into the woods and stick together. I'll come and fetch you when we've sorted this all out. Bill, Charlie, Percy were already sprinting away towards the oncoming marchers. Mr. Weasley tore after them. Ministry wizards were dashing from every direction towards the source of the trouble. The crowds beneath the Roberts family was coming even closer. Come on, said Fred, grabbing Ginny's hand and starting to pull her towards the woods. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and George followed. They all looked back as they reached the trees. The crowds beneath the Roberts family was larger than ever. They could see the ministry wizards trying to get through it to the hooded wizards in the center, but they were having great difficulty. It looked as though they were scared to perform any spells that might make the Roberts family fall. The colored lanterns that had lit the path to the stadium had been extinguished. Dark figures were blundering through the trees. Children were crying. Anxious shouts and panicked voices were reverberating around them in the cold night air. Harry felt himself being pushed hither and thither by people whose faces that he could not see. Then he heard Ron yell with pain. What happened? Said Hermione anxiously, stopping abruptly. That Harry walked right into her. Ron, where are you? Oh, this is stupid. Loomis! She illuminated her wand and directed it in a narrow beam across the path. Ron was lying sprawled on the ground. Tripped over a tree root, he said urgently, getting to his feet again. Well, with feet that size, hard not to, said the drawling voice from behind them. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned sharply. Draco Malfoy was standing alone nearby them, leaning against a tree, looking utterly relaxed. His arms folded, he seemed to have been watching the scene on the campsite through a gap in the trees. Ron told Malfoy to do something that Harry knew he would never have dared say in front of Mr. Weasley. Language, Weasley, said Malfoy, his pale eyes glittering. Hadn't you better be hurrying along now? You wouldn't like her spotted, would you? He nodded towards Hermione. At the same moment, a blast like a bomb sounded from the campsite, and a flash of green light momentarily lit the trees around them. What's that supposed to mean? Said Hermione defiantly. Granger, they're after muggles, said Malfoy. Did you want to be showing off your knickers in midair? Because if you do, hang around. They're moving this way, and it'll give us a good laugh. Hermione's a witch, Harry snarled. Have it your way, Potter, said Malfoy, grinning maliciously. If you think you can't spot a mudblood, stay right there. You watch your mouth, shouted Ron. Everybody Everybody present knew that mudblood was a very offensive term for a witch or wizard of muggle parentage. Never mind, Ron, said Hermione quickly, seizing Rod's arm to restrain him as he took a step towards Malfoy. There came a bang from the other side of the trees that was louder than anything they've heard. Several people nearby screamed. Malfoy chuckled softly. Scare easily, don't they? He said lazily. I suppose your daddy told you all to hide. What's he up to? Trying to rescue the muggles? Where's your parents? Said Harry, his temper rising. Out there wearing the masks, are they? Malfoy turned his face to Harry, still smiling. Well, if they were, I wouldn't likely be telling you, would I, Potter? Oh, come on, Hermione, with a disgusted look at Malfoy. Let's go and find the others. Keep that big bushy head down, Granger, sneered Malfoy. Come on, Hermione, repeated, and she pulled Harry and Ron off to the path again. I bet you anything his dad is one of those masked lot, said Ron hotly. Well, with any luck, the ministry will catch him, said Hermione fervently. Oops. Oh, I can't believe this. Where have the others got to? Fred, George, Ginny were nowhere to be seen, though the path was packed and plenty of other people, all of them looking nervously over their shoulders towards the commotion back at the campsite. A huddle of teenagers in pajamas was arguing ferociously a little way along the path. When they saw Harry, Ron, and Hermione, a girl with thick, curly hair turned and said quickly, Oi, Madame Maxime! Mm, Nos pardon? Sorry, not French, guys. What? That fits. Oh, that girl who spoke and turned her back on them, and they walked on. They distinctly heard her say, Hogwarts. Beauxbaton, muttered Hermione. Sorry? said Harry. They must go to Beauxbaton, said Hermione. You know, Beauxbaton's Academy of Magic. I read about it in the Appraisal of Magical Education in Europe. Oh, yeah, right, said Harry. Fred and George Fred and George can't have gone that far, said Ron, pulling out his wand, lighting it like Hermione, and squinting up the path. Harry dug in his pockets of his jacket for his own wand, but it wasn't there. The only thing he could find were his omnioculars. Oh no, I don't believe it. I've lost my wand. You're kidding. Ron and Hermione raised their wands high enough to spread the narrow beam of light further on the ground. Harry looked all around, but his wand was nowhere to be seen. Maybe it's back in the tent, said Ron. Maybe it fell out of your pocket when they were running, Hermione suggested anxiously. Yeah, said Harry. Maybe. He usually kept his wand with him at all times. In the Wizarding World, and finding himself without in the midst of a scene like this made him feel very vulnerable. A rustling noise, all three of them jumped. Winky, the house elf, was fighting her way out of a clump of bushes nearby. She was moving in a most particular fashion, apparently with great difficulty. It was as though someone invisible was trying to hold her back. There's bad wizards about, she squeaked distinctly, as she leant forward and labored to keep running. People high, people in the air, Winky is getting out of the way. She disappeared into the trees on the other side of the path, panting and squeaking as she fought the force that was restraining her. What's up with her? said Ron, looking curiously after Winky. Why can't she run properly? But she didn't ask permission to hide, said Harry. He was thinking of Dobby. Every time he tried to do something that the Malfoys wouldn't like, he would have to be forced to start beating himself up. House elves get a very raw deal, said Hermione indignantly. It's slavery. That's what it is. Mr. Crouch made her go up on the top of that stadium, and she was terrified. And he's got her bewitched so she can't even run when they start trampling tents. Why doesn't anyone do something about it? Well, the elves are happy, aren't they? Ron said. Your whole old Winky back at the match. House elves is not supposed to have fun. It's That's what she likes, being bossed around. It's people like you, Ron, Hermione began hotly, who pop up rotten in unjust systems just because they're too lazy to. Another loud bang echoed from the edge of the woods. Let's just keep moving, shall we? Said Ron, and Harry saw him glance eagerly at Hermione. Perhaps there was truth in what Malfoy had said. Perhaps Hermione was in more danger than they were. They set off again, Harry still searching his pockets even though he knew his wand wasn't there. They followed the dark path deeper into the woods, still keeping an eye out for Fred, George, and Ginny. They passed a group of goblins who were cackling over a sack of gold that had undoubtedly won betting on the match, who had seemed quite unperturbed by the trouble of the campsite. Further, still along the path, they walked into a patch of silvery light. And when they looked through the trees, they saw the tall, beautiful Vila standing in a clearing, surrounded by a gaggle of young wizards, all of whom were talking very loudly. I'll pull down about 100 sacks of galleons a year, one of them shouted. I'm a dragon killer from the Committee of Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. No, you're not, yelled his friend. You're a dishwasher at the Leaky Cauldron. But I'm a vampire hunter. I've killed about 90 so far. A third wizard, whose pimples were visible even through the dim, silvery light of the villa, now cut in. I'm about to become the youngest ever Minister of Magic, I am. Harry snorted with laughter. He recognized that pimply wizard. His name was Stan Shunpike, and he was, in fact, a conductor of the triple-decker night bus. He turned to Ron. Turned to tell Ron this, but Ron's face had gone oddly slack. The next second, Ron was yelling, Did I tell you I've invented a broomstick that'll reach Jupiter? Honestly. Love Hermione. Honestly, said Hermione again. And she and Harry grabbed Ron firmly by the arms, wheeled him around, and marched him away. By the time the sounds of the villa and their admirers had faded completely, they were in the very heart of the woods. They seemed to be alone now. Everything was much quieter. Harry looked around. I reckon we can just wait here, We'll hear anyone coming a mile off. The words were hardly out of his mouth when Ludo Bagman emerged from behind a tree right ahead of them. Even by the feeble light of the two wands, Harry could see that a great change had come over Bagman. He no longer looked buoyant and rosy-faced. There was no more spring in his step. He looked very white and strained. Who's that? He said, blinking down at them, trying to make out their faces. What are you doing here, all alone? They looked at each other, surprised. Well, there's sort of a riot going on, said Ron. Bagman stared at him. What? On the campsite, some people have got a hold of a family of muggles. Bagman swore loudly. Damn them, he said, looking quite distracted, and without another word he disappeared with a small pop. Not exactly on top of things, Mr. Bagman, is he? Said Hermione, frowning. He was a great beater, though, said Ron, leading his way down the path into a smaller clearing and sitting down on a patch of dry grass at the foot of a tree. The Wimborne Wasps won the league 3 times in a row while he was with them. He took a small figure of Crumb out of his pocket, set it down on the ground, and watched it walk around for a while, like the real Crumb. The model was slightly duck footed and round shouldered, much less impressive on his splayed feet than on his broomstick. Harry was listening out for noise from the campsite. Everything still seemed quiet. Perhaps the riot was over? I hope the others are okay, said Hermione after a while. They'll be fine. Imagine if your dad catches Lucius Malfoy, said Harry, sitting down next to Ron and watching the small figure of Krum slouching over his fallen leaves. He's always said he likes to get something on him. That'll wipe the smirk off the Draco's face, that's right, said Ron. Those poor muggles, though, Hermione said nervously. What if they can't get them down? They will, said Ron reassuringly. They'll find a way. Mad, though, to do something like that when the whole Ministry of Magic out here tonight, said Hermione. I mean, how do they expect to get away with it? Do you think they've been drinking, or are they just... But she broke off abruptly, looked over her shoulder. Harry and Ron looked quickly around too. It sounded as though someone was staggering towards the clearing. They waited, listening to the sounds of uneven steps behind the dark trees, but the footsteps came to a sudden halt. Hello? Called Harry. There was silence. Harry got to his feet and peered around the trees. It was too dark to see very far, but he could sense somebody standing just beyond the range of his vision. Who's there? He said. And then, without warning, the silence was rent by a voice unlike they had heard in the woods. It was uttered not a panicked shout, but what sounded like a spell. Mors Morta. Then something vast, green and glittering, erupted from a patch of darkness Harry's eyes had been struggling to penetrate. It flew up over the treetops and into the sky. What the? Gasped Ron as he sprang to his feet again, staring up at the thing that had appeared. For a split second, Harry thought it was another leprechaun formation. Then he realized it was a colossal skull, composed of what looked like emerald stars, then a serpent protruding from its mouth like a tongue. As he watched, it rose higher and higher, blazing, a haze of greenish smoke etching against the black sky like a new constellation. Suddenly, the wood all around them erupted with screams. Harry didn't understand why, but the only possible cause was the sudden appearance of the skull, which had now risen high enough to illuminate the entire wood, like some grisly neon sign. He scanned the darkness for the person who conjured the skull, but he couldn't see anyone. Who's there? He called again. Harry, come on, move! Hermione was seizing the back of his jacket and was tugging him backwards. What's the matter? Harry said, startled to see her face, so white and terrified. It's the dark mark, Harry, Hermione moaned, pulling him as hard as she could. You know whose sign? Voldemort's? Harry, come on! Harry turned. Ron was hurriedly scooping up his miniature Krum. The three of them started across the clearing, but before they had taken more than a few hurried steps, a series of popping noises announced the arrival of 20 wizards appearing from the air, surrounding them. Harry whirled around, and in a split second he registered one fact. Each of these wizards had their wands out, and every wand was pointed right at himself, Ron, and Hermione. Without pausing to think, he yelled, Duck! He seized the other two and pulled them down to the ground. Stupefy! Roared 20 voices. They were a blinding series of flashes, and Harry felt the hair on his head ripple as though a powerful wind had swept the clearing. Raising his head a fraction with an inch, he saw jets of fiery red light flying over them from the wizard's wands, crossing each other, bouncing off tree trunks and rebounding into the darkness. Stop! Yelled a voice he recognized. Stop! That's my son! Harry's hair stopped blowing about. He raised his head a little higher. The wizard in front of him had lowered his wand. He rolled over and saw Mr. Weasley striding towards them, looking terrified. Ron, Harry, his voice sounded shakily. Hermione, are you all right? Out of the way, Arthur, said a cold, curt voice. It was Mr. Crouch. He and the other Ministry wizards were closing in on them. Harry got to his feet to face them. Mr. Crouch's face was taut with rage. Which of you did it? He snapped, his sharp eyes darting between them. Which of you conjured the dark mark? We didn't do that, said Harry, gesturing at the skull. We didn't do anything, said Ron, who was rubbing his elbow, looking indignantly at his father. What did you want to attack us for? Do not lie, sir, shouted Mr. Crouch. His wand was still pointing directly at Ron, and his eyes were popping. He looked slightly mad. You have been discovered at the scene of the crime! Barty whispered a witch in a long woolen dressing gown. They're kids, Barty. They've never have been able to. Where did the dark mark come from, you three? Said Mr. Weasley quickly. Over there, said Hermione shakily, pointing at the place where they had heard the voice. There was someone behind the trees. They were shouting words of incantation. Oh, stood over there, did they? Said Mr. Crouch, turning his popping eyes on Hermione, now disbelief etched all over his face. Said an incantation, did they? You seem very well informed on how the dark mark is summoned, Missy. But none of the mystery wizards, apart from Mr. Crouch, seemed to think it was remotely likely that Harry, Ron, or Hermione had conjured the dark skull. On the contrary, at Hermione's words, they had raised all their wands again and were pointing in the direction she had indicated, squinting through the dark trees. You're too late, said the witch in the woolen nightdress, shaking her head. They've disapparated. I don't think so, said the wizard with a scrubby brown beard. It was Amos Diggory, Cedric's father. Our stunners went right through those trees. There's a good chance we've got them. Amos, be careful, said a few of the wizards warningly, as Mr. Diggory squared off his shoulders, raised his wand, marched across the clearing, and disappeared into the darkness. Hermione watched him vanish, and her hands over her mouth. A few seconds later, they heard Mr. Diggory shout, Yes! We got them! There's someone here, unconscious. But, blimey. You've got someone? Shouted Mr. Crouch, standing highly disbelieving. Who? Who is it? They heard snapping twigs and rustling of leaves, and then crunching footsteps as Mr. Diggory re-emerged from behind the trees. He was carrying a tiny limp figure in his arms. Harry recognized the tea towel at once. It was Winky. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak as Diggory deposited Mr. Crouch's elf on the ground at his feet. The other Ministry wizards were all staring at Mr. Crouch. For a few seconds, Crouch remained transfixed, his eyes blazing in his white face as he stared down at Winky. Then he appeared to come to life again. This cannot be, he said jerkily. No! He moved quickly around Mr. Diggory and strode off towards the place where he found Winky. No point, Mr. Crouch, Mr. Diggory called after him. There's no one else there. But Mr. Crouch did not seem prepared to take his word for it. They could hear him moving around and rustling the leaves as he pushed the bushes aside, searching. Bit embarrassing, Mr. Diggory said grimly, looking down at Winky's unconscious form. Barty Crouch's house elf? I mean to say. Come off it, Amos, said Mr. Weasley quietly. You don't seriously think it was his elf. The dark mark's a wizard sign. It requires a wand. Yeah, said Mr. Diggory, and she had a wand. What? Here, look. Mr. Diggory held up the wand and showed it off to Mr. Weasley. Had it in her hand. So that's Clause 3 of the Code of Wand. Hold on. That's Clause 3 of the Code of Wand. Use broken for a start. No non-human creature is permitted to carry or use a wand. Just then, there was another pop, and Ludo Bagman apparated right next to Mr. Weasley, looking breathless and disoriented. He spun on the spot, goggling upwards at the emerald green skull. The dark mark, he panted, almost tramping Winky as he turned inquiringly to his colleagues. Who did it? Did you get them? Barty, what's going on? Mr. Crouch had returned empty-handed. His face was still ghostly white, and his hands and mustache were still twitching. Where have you been, Barty? Said Bagman. Why weren't you at the match? Your elf was saving your seat, too. Gulping gargoyles, Bagman had just noticed Winky lying at his feet. What happened to her? I have been busy, Ludo, said Crouch, still talking in the same jerky fashion, barely moving his lips. My elf has been stunned. Stunned by you lot, you mean? But why? Comprehension dawned suddenly on Bagman's round, shiny face. He looked up at the skull and down at Winky and then at Mr. Crouch. No, he said. Winky, conjure the dark mark? She wouldn't know how. She'd need a wand for a start. And she had one, said Mr. Diggory. I found her holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself. Crouch gave no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory. But Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence for assent. He raised his wand, pointed at Winky, and said, Renervate? Renervate. Winky stared feebly. Her great brown eyes opened and blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silent wizards, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet, and slowly, tremulously, raised her eyes to stare up into his face. Then, more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Harry could see the floating skull reflected twice in her enormous, glossy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked wildly around the crowd, clearing, and burst into terrified sobs. Elf, said Mr. Diggory sternly, do you know who I am? I'm a member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Winky began to rock backwards and forwards on the ground.